As raindrops hit the window, Peppa's family was gathered indoors, enjoying their time together. They were expecting the rain to pass soon and discussed how fun it would be to jump in muddy puddles the next morning. Little did they know, a devastating loss was about to strike them. That day, as everyone was getting ready for bed, the rain continued to pour throughout the night. In the morning, an excited Peppa ran out of the house, ready to jump in muddy puddles. However, as she stepped outside, she noticed that there was a massive flood surrounding their home, with no other dry land in sight. Daddy Pig did not expect this either and jumped out of the house right into the water. It was the worst flood the Peppa Pig family had ever witnessed. As they discussed their situation, they realized that their mobile phones were not working, leaving them completely isolated. Unable to swim, and with nowhere within walking distance, they decided to wait it out. Mummy Pig started to prepare breakfast but discovered that there wasn't much food left. They had been planning to go to the supermarket that day. Mummy Pig estimated that they had about 2 days' worth of food left. She also predicted that in 2 days the water level would recede enough for them to walk to their neighbors or for help to arrive, so there was no need to panic. However, as the next night fell, more rain poured down, causing the pig parents to worry. The water level hadn't decreased at all. By the end of the second day, the situation was the same. On the third morning, there was no improvement. No help had arrived, the water hadn't subsided, and they had run out of food. There was nothing left for breakfast. George took a few sips of ketchup from a bottle just to have something in his stomach. On the fourth day, hunger began to take its toll. Peppa, weakened by exhaustion, started to feel sick. She had contracted some sort of illness. George and the parents were holding up well. By the fifth day, Peppa did not leave her room anywhere. The parents could endure not having food, but they were afraid for their children. In addition to hunger, they suffered from utter boredom. Towards the evening of sixth day, George too fell ill, his young body unable to handle the lack of food. Parents was crying that day, which upset George, feeling powerless in the situation. George woke up on the seventh morning to a strange smell coming from the kitchen. His parents told him that they had found some food for him, his first proper meal in 5 days. It was strange food, unlike anything George had ever eaten before. The texture was soft and chewy. Perhaps it was the extreme hunger, or perhaps it was the taste itself, but he found it delicious. The parents watched him with empty stares. Suddenly they heard a voice from the street. Grandpa Pig had arrived in a small boat bringing food supplies. He was relieved to find his family, but it was too late. The family was now missing one member. This terrible day started with an unremarkable rain. Peppa and George were waiting for the rain to end so they could go outside to play. They did not yet know how this day would turn out. They waited for the sun to come out and asked their parents if they could go for a walk. When they left the house, they found puddles left by the rain and started to jump in them, as they had done many times before. However, that day they decided to try to find the biggest puddle. They walked further and further away from home. They went so far that their parents could no longer see them. George saw a big puddle and wanted to jump in it, but Peppa stopped him. She wanted to make sure the puddle was safe enough for him, but she didn't think about her own safety. That was the worst mistake of the day. Her whole body sank into the puddle. A nose was barely visible on the surface of the puddle from the recently cheerful pig. George couldn't contain his horror and started to cry. He realized that help was needed as soon as possible. He could hardly remember the way home and ran in the random direction. After some time, he did not notice a puddle under his feet and fell into it himself. He was pulled up to his waist in mud. He couldn't get out no matter how hard he tried, but the upper half of his body was free. All he could do was scream and call for help from the puddle. Because George had run too far away from his parents, they couldn't hear him. An hour after Peppa Pig and her brother went for a walk, Mummy Pig started to worry. She talked about it with Daddy Pig, and they went out to look for their children. After 20 minutes of searching, they reported their children missing. After that, every resident started looking for Peppa and George. The search lasted for several hours, and even helicopters were involved. George was the first to be spotted by Daddy Pig, who heard faint cries for help, approached, and saw him. George was in a state of hypothermia. He had caught a cold from the damp and was exhausted. Daddy Pig pulled him out and tried to find out where Peppa was. George himself has slurred speech due to his age, but because he had been in the mud for several hours, all that could be understood from his speech was that something terrible had happened to Peppa. Then George slowly started walking in one direction. He stopped at the same puddle where Peppa got stuck. There was nothing on the surface of the puddle, as there were no footprints nearby. Since then, no one likes to jump in muddy puddles anymore. Peppa Pig's family loves to visit the amusement park during holidays, having a wonderful time. But this time, something went wrong and turned out very, very badly. This is the balloon ride incident. As soon as they arrived, they saw Mrs. Rabbit doing a raffle. Peppa bought a ticket and won the balloon ride with her family. Peppa dreamed of trying a hot air balloon ride, and now her dream was coming true. As they began their flight, Mrs. Rabbit said it was her first time flying a balloon. Daddy Pig was alarmed by this. He thought about stopping the flight and going back, but he didn't want to spoil Peppa's fun. Once they were high enough, it turned out that Mrs. Rabbit didn't even know how to use the map, which further showed her incompetence. Looking around, Peppa dropped her favorite toy, and they decided to go down to find it. Daddy Pig lifted Teddy from the tree, but at that moment no one was looking where the balloon was going. The balloon got stuck in a tree. There was no one in sight. They were alone in the middle of the forest. After studying the map, Daddy Pig realized that they were very far from everyone. They called for help with a loudspeaker for several hours, but no one answered. At this point, Daddy Pig decided that due to the distance from the others, they could wait for help for days, so he'd better carefully climb down the tree and go for help. However, when he climbed down the tree, his foot slipped, and in an attempt to grab the tree, he badly scratched his hands and finally fell. As soon as he regained consciousness, he felt pain. His leg was broken. His family was shocked, but he said that the bruises were minor and that he would be able to get to the help he needed so badly. At that moment, this idea seemed good to him. Because of the adrenaline rush, his pain was dulled. His family dissuaded him, but he walked in the direction of the nearest settlement. At first he walked with a limp, then began to crawl, then stopped. Peppa Pig watched as his body lay motionless, not responding to being called. Mrs. Rabbit realized that it was all her fault. She decided to climb down the tree to give Daddy Pig first aid. She had rock climbing skills, but she did not take into account that there were traces of Daddy Pig's blood on the tree, from which she slipped and fell right on her neck. Her body lay motionless. Peppa and George cried. It was too dangerous to climb down themselves, and all that remained was to hope that help would come. Help arrived about an hour after the incident. The locals saw where the balloon was going, and after it did not return for a long time, they became worried and went in that direction. That day, they lost two valuable persons. When the snowflakes begin to fall from the sky, and the streets and houses are gradually wrapped in snow, Peppa Pig's family feels the unique atmosphere of the upcoming Christmas. During these moments, Peppa likes to spend time with her beloved brother George. However, from that day on, she would never be able to play with him again. This is the story of a missing person, the investigation of which dragged on for several months. It all started with unremarkable snow. Peppa and George ran outside to play in the snow. They were enjoying the winter. The snow was very deep that day. After they had played enough, they decided to return home. But George did not go in. When Peppa had lunch, she decided to go back outside and saw a big snowball. She realized that George had started building the snowman without her, but most likely got tired and went home. She completed the snowman with head, and then came to her room to show the snowman to George, but he wasn't there. She got worried and told her parents. The parents went to look for George. They couldn't find George. When they called the police, the investigation has begun. The police could not find any traces of George due to the fact that the parents had already trampled around while searching. They could only find the blue hat left by George. A month passed, followed by another, but no one could find George. What made him run away? And where is he now? When Peppa went home, he decided to return for some reason, but the way out of the house goes down the slope. He fell during the descent. Due to the slope of the mountain, he did not stop when falling and began to tumble down the mountain. Snow began to stick to him, gradually forming a ball. When that ball of snow with George inside stopped, George couldn't even move. He could barely breathe. He was lying without oxygen, unable to move and in the freezing cold. It's a terrible situation. He was probably alive when Peppa was building the snowman, but he couldn't call for help from Peppa, who was decorating the snowman in the meantime. No one has touched the snowman since then. However, it could not stand forever. And one warm spring morning, Peppa went for a walk and saw her brother. Since then, she has been afraid of snowmen, of what might lurk inside them. Peppa's family loves spending time together. This time they were playing hide and seek. No one could have guessed how badly it would end. It all started with George not being the best player. He decided to hide under the table. Peppa immediately found him and scolded him for hiding poorly, saying that next time he needed to find a better place. Next time he was hiding, he decided to find the most unexpected place. He thought he would definitely win. His parents encouraged him, and he went to find a place to hide. He ran into his parents' room and saw a quite tall vase. He figured that if he could fit in there, Peppa wouldn't be able to find him. He brought a chair, stood on it, and began to climb into the vase head first. However, he couldn't. He got stuck upside down, unable to get out. He started to worry and was about to call for help, but he thought if he could just squeeze a bit further, he could flip over into the wider bottom of the vase. He squeezed as much as he could, exhaling the remaining air from his lungs. He pushed a bit further, but not all the way. The situation only got worse. He realized he couldn't get out and tried to scream but couldn't. There was no air left in his lungs, and he couldn't even breathe properly because his body was compressed. His heart pounded from anxiety, worsening the situation because the vase had limited oxygen, which was quickly depleting over time. He waited and waited for Peppa to find him. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, Peppa entered the room and saw the top part of George sticking out of the vase. Peppa was happy that she had found him and laughed at him for choosing a conspicuous hiding spot again. However, George didn't react at all. He didn't move his legs or make any sounds. Peppa realized something was wrong. She stood on a chair and tried to reach him with her hands, but the vase slipped and fell to the ground, shattering. Peppa watched as her motionless brother lay among the vase shards, the shards embedded in his hands, legs, stomach and face. A red puddle quickly formed on the floor. Peppa immediately screamed, calling for their parents' help. They were shocked and rushed George to the hospital. He received numerous stitches, lay in a coma for several days, but he survived. Scars remained on his body, reminding him of that day. He no longer enjoyed playing hide and seek. Peppa and George loved playing together outside, but on this day, leaving the house was the worst decision. The storm caused terrible losses to their family. That day, Peppa went with George for a picnic outside. They took toys with them, and under the sunny weather, they ate cookies with juice. As soon as they finished, they heard thunder. A storm was approaching, and Mummy Pig called them to go home as quickly as possible. Daddy Pig wasn't worried about it, but the sky was getting darker and darker. But then it turned out that Peppa had left a toy in the garden, and Daddy Pig went to retrieve it, not thinking about his safety. He went down to the toy, and then lightning struck. Lightning struck a tree he was standing too close to. He fell unconscious. His family watched this happen. Peppa and George were scared, and Mummy Pig ran to call an ambulance. But when she dialed the number, she realized that the connection wasn't working because of the storm. She told Peppa to stay at home, and she herself ran to Daddy Pig. He lay unconscious under the cold rain, but he had a pulse. Mummy Pig was glad that he was alive. She thought she could carry him home. But when she tried to pull him home, she couldn't do it. He weighed too much, and the path home was slippery from the rain. She could never have carried him up the hill to the house. Mummy Pig ran to the nearest neighbors, leaving George and Peppa alone. They sat at home and shuddered at every roll of thunder. Meanwhile, Daddy Pig was still alive. He began to regain consciousness, but was paralyzed. Because the rain didn't stop, a puddle began to form under him. When Mummy Pig tried to move him, she left him face down. Now, in addition to hypothermia from the cold and wetness, His face was pressed right into the mud. It was getting harder for him to breathe. Almost an hour later, the storm had already ended, and at that time, Mummy Pig came with Dr. Brown Bear. But Daddy Pig was no longer breathing. After a long time, Mummy Pig continues to blame herself for this, and Peppa and George will never stop being afraid of thunder. It all started when Daddy Pig was tired. He was tired of work and family, and he wanted to be alone for a day. This day he was able to take a day off from work and go to the forest instead. It was a place where he could have some quiet time to himself. He took some food and his phone and went to the forest. He went to the forest without telling anyone. This is the reason for the horrible situation he got into. He stopped the car in the middle of the road and walked into the woods. Here he could think without the distractions of family. He walked deeper and deeper into the forest until he finally found a clearing. He laid out a picnic on it, but suddenly remembered that he had forgotten his lighter in the car to start a fire. It was far enough away from the car, but he decided to walk there and back. There was no sign of trouble. He walked the same route, but halfway there he heard a crunch. A tree had fallen on him. Now Daddy Pig was lying on the grass, pinned down by the massive tree. He couldn't move to get out. The tree was pressing down on him so hard that he could barely breathe. For such cases, he has a phone in his backpack. All he has to do is get it out and call for help. He opens his backpack but doesn't find his phone. Daddy Pig left his phone at the picnic site, and now he has no hope of salvation. He screamed, calling for help, but there was no one in the woods. The next day, his back began to hurt seriously. He began to suffer from hunger and lack of movement. He could put up with the hunger, but the next morning he ran out of water. He stayed thirsty until the evening until it started to rain. He collected rainwater in a bottle. The pain was constant, but what truly tormented him was the fear of never seeing his family again. So he survived day by day, growing weaker and weaker. It had been at least a week. He had stopped counting the days. He lay there and imagined that he would be gone. He should have told everyone where he was going. He should have kept his phone with him at all times. At that moment, he felt that he could breathe freely, and gripped by hope, he tried again to get out from under the tree. He succeeded. He had lost a terrible amount of weight, which allowed him to squeeze through. Now he was free, but days of lying in one position had taken their toll. He couldn't get up. His body had weakened and all he could do was crawl. He could crawl to the car, but the picnic has food and a phone, that's all he needs. He headed that way. It was incredibly difficult. With every movement, he had a feeling he was about to pass out. But the thought that he would be able to eat and call for help motivated him. However, when he crawled, he realized a terrible thing. The food he laid out had already rotted or been eaten by birds. He tried to call his family, but the phone was broken. Perhaps it happened because of the water that got on it during the rain. Daddy Pig might have guessed, but he was no longer guided by reason. He should have crawled to the car then, although it is unlikely that he could drive a car in such a state. Now, all he could do was crawl and crawl towards the car, hoping that he could get out of the forest.
I had a salad made for this morning, but I dreamed of something more substantial, something that would fit my nature. I know I'm not allowed to eat meat. That's how we live here. But sometimes I can't stand it. A wolf should eat meat. My cave, nestled deep in the forest, was a place where I could hide my true nature from the eyes of my neighbors. There were a lot of ducks in the lake nearby. I knew I had to be careful. If anyone walked by and noticed what I was doing, they might kick me out of here or do something worse to me. That's why I go hunting very early, when everyone is still asleep, and the ducks have just arrived at the lake. I went deeper into the bushes. I waited, and finally I saw a duck. The duck came out of the lake, and I jumped on it. When I got to the cave, the duck was still moving in my mouth, bleeding. Back in my cave, I started butchering the duck. The air was filled with the smell of fresh meat, which I had already forgotten in this vegetarian world. I worked fast. I need to hurry. I shouldn't have been caught doing this. There are no feathers left on the duck. The skin was torn in places. The internal organs have already been extracted. When I was about to make a fire to roast it, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was walking right towards my cave. Who is it? What does he want from me? I turned around. It was George. He was following the blood trail. How could I forget and leave such traces behind me? I hid the duck behind a rock, trying not to leave any evidence. He was still standing at the exit, not daring to enter the dark cave. I hoped that he could not see anything, because his eyes were not adjusted to the darkness. I told him he'd better go home. But he suddenly ran into the cave, right to that stone. I think he saw me put something there. I couldn't stop him, and now he's grabbed the duck. It was my meal, my secret. He looked like he didn't understand what it was. I tried to keep my cool and told him it was just a toy I found in the woods. I think it worked and he believed it. But what if it doesn't? And he will tell everyone. He can't speak yet, but letting him go is a risk. I thought about killing George. I thought about the tender pork that was in front of me. I've never eaten pork. I could end it all right here. I'll hide his remains well, and no one will find him. No one will know the secret. But then,
George!
I heard the distant call of his parents. Their screams echoed through the forest, snapping me out of my fantasies. If they find me with George dead, it could end very badly. I took a deep breath and took the duck out of George's hands. I said, "Let's go find your mom and dad." I couldn't let his parents find traces of blood on the ground. I washed the blood off me. Then I led George through the forest. I found his parents and told them not to go so deep into the forest and keep an eye on their child. I returned to the cave, where no one was around anymore, and I was able to enjoy my lunch.